Unit 8. Variancest. The variance process and legal framework. Variances are legal mechanisms that allow communities to grant relief from specific regulatory requirements when strict application would cause exceptional hardship. In floodplain management, variances are available, but are subject to very strict criteria because they can increase flood risks to both the applicant and neighbouring properties. The variance process is typically administered by a Board of Appeals or similar body, not by the floodplain administrator. This separation ensures that variance decisions receive independent review and are not made by the same official responsible for day-to-day permit administration. Variance applications must be submitted in writing and must include detailed justification addressing each of the variance criteria. The application should include site plans, construction details, engineering analyses if applicable, and any other information needed to evaluate the request. Public notice and hearing are required for all variance requests. This ensures that neighbouring property owners and other interested parties have the opportunity to comment on requests that might affect them. The notice must be provided in advance and must include sufficient detail for the public to understand what is being requested. The variance hearing provides an opportunity for the applicant to present their case and for the public to comment. The board must consider all testimony and evidence before making a decision. The hearing record becomes part of the official file and may be important if the decision is appealed. Documentation of variance decisions must be maintained by the community and must include the specific findings related to each variance criterion, the conditions attached to any approved variance, and the rationale for the board's decision. The 5 variance criteria NFIP regulations establish 5 criteria that must be met for variance approval. All 5 criteria must be satisfied. Meeting some but not all criteria is not sufficient for variance approval. These criteria are designed to ensure that variances are granted only in truly exceptional circumstances. The first criterion requires that the variance be based on good and sufficient cause. This means there must be legitimate reasons for the variance request that are based on the physical characteristics of the property or other factors beyond the applicant's control. The second criterion requires that failure to grant the variance would result in exceptional hardship to the applicant. The hardship must be exceptional, meaning it goes beyond the ordinary inconvenience or expense that results from compliance with regulations. Economic hardship alone is not sufficient. The third criterion requires that the granting of the variance will not result in increased flood heights, additional threats to public safety, extraordinary public expense, or create nuisances, cause fraud on or victimize the public, or conflict with existing local laws or ordinances. The fourth criterion requires that the variance be the minimum necessary, considering the flood hazard, to afford relief. This means the board must grant the smallest variance possible that still addresses the exceptional hardship. The fifth criterion requires that the applicant has been notified in writing that the variance may result in increased premiums for flood insurance and that such construction may not be eligible for certain forms of federal disaster assistance. What constitutes good and sufficient cause? Good and sufficient cause typically relates to physical characteristics of the property that make compliance with normal requirements particularly difficult or impossible. These might include unusual topography, soil conditions, access limitations, or the presence of other structures or natural features. Lot size and shape can sometimes provide good and sufficient cause, particularly when lots were created before flood regulations were adopted and are too small or poorly shaped to accommodate compliant construction. However, the lot characteristics must be beyond the applicant's control. Existing development patterns in the area might support a variance request if they create physical constraints that make compliance particularly difficult. For example, if all surrounding properties have similar development patterns, strict compliance might result in a building that is completely out of character with the neighborhood. Unusual soil or groundwater conditions might support a variance request if they make standard foundation types impractical or if they create exceptional construction costs. However, these conditions must be documented through professional analysis. Access limitations can sometimes provide good and sufficient cause if they make standard compliance approaches impractical. This might include properties with very steep access, limited street frontage, or other physical constraints. Historic designation can sometimes support variance requests when compliance requirements would destroy the historic character of a structure or district. However, historic designation alone is not sufficient. There must still be exceptional hardship related to compliance, exceptional hardship requirements. Exceptional hardship must be related to the physical characteristics of the property and must go beyond the ordinary inconvenience or expense associated with regulatory compliance. The hardship must be exceptional compared to what other similarly situated properties experience. Economic hardship alone is never sufficient for variance approval. The fact that compliance is expensive or that a variance would be financially beneficial is not grounds for approval. The hardship must be related to physical constraints or other factors beyond economic considerations. Self-created hardship typically disqualifies variance requests. If an applicant has created the conditions that make compliance difficult, such as by subdividing property in a way that creates non-compliant lots, a variance is generally not appropriate. The timing of property acquisition can affect hardship determinations. If someone purchases property in a flood-prone area after flood regulations are adopted, they are presumed to have known about the requirements and cannot claim hardship based on those requirements. Hardship must be unique to the specific property, not shared by all properties in the area. If all properties in an area would experience the same difficulties with compliance, that suggests the regulations themselves may be inappropriate rather than that variances are needed. The hardship must be related to the flood hazard regulations specifically, not to building codes, zoning requirements, or other regulations. Variances from flood regulations cannot be used to address problems with other regulatory requirements. Special considerations for V-zones. Coastal high hazard areas, V-zones, are subject to additional restrictions on variances because of the extreme nature of coastal flood hazards. Variances in V-zones may only be issued for the reconstruction, rehabilitation, or restoration of structures following damage due to a disaster. The structure must have been previously compliant with NFIP requirements, or must have been constructed before the area was mapped as a V-zone. Variances cannot be used to allow construction that was never compliant with applicable requirements. Even when variances are granted in V-zones, the structure must still be elevated on posts, piers, columns, or piles, and the space below the lowest floor must remain free of obstruction, or must be constructed with breakaway walls, open wood lattice work, or insect screening. All other V-zone requirements continue to apply, including the use of flood-resistant materials below the base flood elevation, proper anchoring to resist wind and wave forces, and compliance with building code requirements for high wind areas. Variances in V-zones are rare and are granted only in the most exceptional circumstances. The extreme forces involved in coastal flooding make even small deviations from standard requirements potentially very dangerous. Insurance and federal assistance implications. Property owners who receive variances must be notified in writing about the insurance and federal assistance implications of their decision to build in a manner that does not fully comply with floodplain management requirements. This notification is required as part of the variance process. Flood insurance rates for properties built under variance may not receive subsidized rates and may be subject to higher premiums based on the actual risk posed by the non-compliant construction. The property owner must be made aware of these potential rate implications. Federal disaster assistance may not be available for properties built under variance if they are damaged in future floods. This includes both individual assistance programs and public assistance for community infrastructure. Property owners must understand these limitations before proceeding with construction under variance. The variance notification must be provided in writing and must be acknowledged by the property owner before construction begins. This ensures that the property owner makes an informed decision about whether to proceed with non-compliant construction. Communities must maintain records of all variance notifications and acknowledgements as part of their NFIP compliance documentation. These records may be reviewed during community assistance visits and may be important if questions arise about proper notification. Common variance mistakes. One of the most common mistakes in variance administration is approving requests based solely on economic hardship. While compliance costs may be discussed as part of a variance request, economic factors alone never justify variance approval. Another common mistake is failing to require that all 5 variance criteria be met. Some communities approve variances when only some criteria are satisfied, which is not consistent with NFIP requirements and can jeopardize the community's participation in the program. Granting variances that are larger than necessary is another frequent problem. The variance must be the minimum necessary to address the exceptional hardship, not the maximum that might be convenient for the applicant. Failing to provide proper public notice or to conduct required hearings can invalidate variance decisions. The due process requirements for variances are important both for legal validity and for ensuring that affected parties have input into decisions. Not documenting the specific findings related to each variance criterion makes it difficult to defend variance decisions if they are challenged, and makes it impossible to demonstrate compliance with NFIP requirements during audits or reviews.